Hello and welcome from the First United Methodist Church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. This video is going to include a sermon that is going to be considered by some people to be political. And I want to say yes and no and explain what's going on here. Let me start out with a book that a lot of people have read and that a lot of people find very healthy and helpful in their own personal lives. It's called Boundaries. You may or may not have seen it. It's by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And they talk a little bit about the importance of maintaining boundaries in one's personal life and in one's spiritual life. They say this on page 29. Boundaries define us. They define what is me and what is not me. A boundary shows me where I end and someone else begins, leading me to a sense of ownership. A few pages later, page 48, they say this. We need to take responsibility for all the above areas of our souls. These lie within our boundaries. But taking care of what lies within our boundaries isn't easy. Neither is allowing other people to take care of what lies within their boundaries. Setting boundaries and maintaining them is hard work. The sermon today is going to be part of that hard work because churches, no less than individuals, have their boundaries, and healthy churches will have healthy boundaries, and so will healthy governments. In the book of Revelation, which I'm preaching my way through, at least the early parts of it, we see the early Christian communities that were forming in the first generation or so after the resurrection, defining their boundaries with respect to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire did not like that they were saying sometimes, no, we're not going to do that. If we are to be truly Christian, there are some limits here. And that has been a constant struggle over the ages. Sometimes the church has had to be told to back off. There have been times when the church has gone too far. And then there are some times when the world has gone too far. It is incumbent upon each of us in our own lives to set our boundaries. But it's also incumbent on us in our life together as a church to set some boundaries. And that can be hard work. Sometimes we have to say no to the outside world. Sometimes we have to say no to ourselves. And when that balance gets out of whack, when those boundaries become unhealthily blurred, things happen where perhaps here's where the tricky part comes in here, where I'm going to get in trouble, but I don't care. I care, but I'm going to say it anyway. When the government tries to co-opt the church, somebody has to say no. And that's in part what the sermon is about today. Just as if the church tries to co opt the government, somebody should say no. We live in a society that is not monolithic. And if we are to respect one another and receive respect from one another, it means we don't always get our own way. And it also means we need to pay attention to our boundaries. So, right now, I'm sort of preaching the sermon itself. I'm going to stop here and invite you to watch on, even better to join us for worship in person. And we'll begin with these words from the book of Revelation, chapter 2, beginning at verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of the first and the last, who is dead and who came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you're rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear to listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. It sounds kind of silly now when I think about it, but I dreaded turning 30. And my annual physical that year didn't help matters very much. Since my family doctor decided that that was a logical and reasonable point at which to take a look in his little crystal ball and start telling me what he saw. Yeah, he said, your eyesight is pretty good right now, but in 10 years or so, you're going to need glasses. And a few minutes later, it was, your weight is good, and I'm happy with it, but if you aren't careful, it's going to be a problem, at least potentially, in about 15 years if you don't take care. And then, not long after that, given your family history, I'm not really worried about it. But I think it would be a good idea for you to take it easy on the French fries and on the ice cream before it becomes a problem. And hey, that makes me think it might be a good idea, as long as you're here right now. Um, let's take an EKG so that we can put it in your records. And if we ever by some chance need a baseline reading, we'll have it right there. It was not a great thing to be saying. And I knew the doctor well enough. He was my family doctor from my teenage years. And I knew him well enough that at that point I could say to him, hey, Glenn, um, do you remember when you were a resident and you were getting ready to take over the practice from Dr. Hecking? Don't you remember how you used to have a full head of hair? He took the hint. And mind you, looking back on this, and he laughed it off, but he knew what he was doing. And I still to this day consider him probably one of the best family doctors I know across the board, not just for myself, but that I've seen work with other people. He was totally right in trying to prepare a patient for what could potentially be ahead in order to guide it in a good direction so it wouldn't become a problem. The future is not definite, but some possibilities are always foreseeable. John's brief message to the church in Smyrna, found along with others at the beginning of the book of Revelation, is kind of a parallel to the doctor's observations and what he was doing. John could foresee events that were going on right then, notably for himself, his own banishment to the island of Patmos, as heading off in a direction that he would not have wanted anybody to go. He knew or sensed or was told that the church in Smyrna was going to be in a pretty rough spot very shortly. And he felt that on his heart. And so he let them know. Part of what John saw was increasing conflict, both within the community and around it. As background, there was a time very early in the church's history, and I mean the church as a whole, not just the church in Smyrna, but the church as a whole, when Jesus' followers thought about themselves as Jews who had experienced the life and learned the teachings of and seen the resurrection of a Jewish Messiah. And now they were continuing, as they understood it, the life of the people of Israel in a new and a regenerated kind of a way, brought to life even as the Messiah had been brought to life. To a large extent, the Romans continued to consider these Christians simply a subset of Jews, if they even made any distinction for decades to come. And it was a very tricky situation, made worse because when the Romans and the Jews went to war in Judea, a war that ended in the destruction of Jerusalem itself, the smaller parties within Judaism had fought, sometimes physically, against one another. And the accusations of having brought down disaster or having not stood up enough continued in the settlements to which the Jews fled throughout the Mediterranean in the years around 70 AD. So the suspicion and resentment, which was part of all of that, can be heard in things that someone like John would write when he said, I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews, but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And unfortunately, that language has been used unfairly against Jewish people down to our own day, long after the two groups have become separate sister faiths. And that language has been used to justify bigotry and persecution against the Jews when, ironically, John was warning that it was the Christians who were hearing the slander about themselves from within the religious community. And he foresaw that turning into a pretext for persecution of the Christians coming from beyond it, from the local authorities, the local pagan authorities. Now as then, when people of faith fail to respect one another, it gives permission for others outside the religious community to follow their example. And trouble begins. The toxic atmosphere of our own day is one where it is increasingly common and increasingly kind of glossed over when people express their thoughts about who is or is not a real Christian. That's bad. Especially if they start talking about people as fake Christians. It sets us up, all of us, for trouble from outside. And whether it's said with indignation or with sadness or embarrassment, we can all identify a group or two that say that they are Christian that we would really have no problem identifying as not exactly Christian. Even going so far sometimes to say that they're really nothing but a gathering of synagogue. That word means gathering, a coming together. That these people are really nothing but a coming together, a rally, if you will, of the like-minded and the wrong-headed. Those people, them, they act like they're us, but they're not. Whatever did happen to us, huh? Whatever happened to a sense of we're in it together? We can question people's actions, and that's okay. But to question people's actual faith and where their heart is with the Lord, that is not our place. And here's the thing, too, and this is part of the predictive element of John's message. When that goes on, it's easy to see it becoming worse quickly. And for the self-righteousness that's in all of us to be exploited in truly harmful ways for very bad ends by people who truly do not care about right or wrong or what the facts of a situation are, but only themselves and how they can exploit the situation. Get back to Dr. Ortley. He could only offer his advice because he knew my family's medical histories. And he knew how we, as people, behaved. So much so that 15 years after the appointment I described, I would walk into his office for another annual physical, and one of his first questions would be, "Well, I just saw your parents last week for their checkups. What are they not telling me?" And I would know for sure exactly what they weren't telling him. And he knew for sure that they'd left something out. He understood how things worked or didn't always work, and he used it for good. In my capacity, I feel like right now I'm in a similar spot. For what it's worth, I've been in enough of the church world long enough, and I've lived in this country all my life as well. And I think that if I put out a few ideas, you can take them or leave them. But they're not coming from a place with no background at all. John had his observations and his conclusions, and I, at the same time, am offering mine. Now, I don't put them on the same plane by any means. My observations, my conclusions may be wrong, dead wrong. And in some ways, I hope they are dead wrong. But one thing they are not is random. And one thing that I believe they are is fully in line with the scriptures and the message that John had on his heart for Smyrna. Since 1954, in this country, we have had an understanding, a formalized understanding of one of the ways that church and state maintain good, healthy boundaries. We understand that each has its place and each has a right to speak, and generally that people, including church and state, should take their turns speaking instead of shouting each other down or manipulating each other. There is a formalized way of saying, look, we're not going to hijack one another's roles. And sure, there is always going to be a gray area. But people who live with complex identities, people who relate to both God and Caesar in varying ways, should treat one another with respect without making power plays and without using matters of conscience to gain control. Traditionally, we've called this a wall of separation between church and state. But in 1954, that was embodied in a way that it had not been previously. It was embodied in, of all things, tax regulations by the Internal Revenue Service. And a regulation that was put forward, and it's called the Johnson Amendment because it was Lyndon Johnson who suggested the wording. And the Johnson Amendment has said that nonprofits, including religious institutions, have the right, I'd add the duty, but he left it at the right, to advocate for issues that they consider important, moral issues, ethical issues, social issues. But they do not have the right to become involved in electoral politics and party politics, or to endorse specific candidates. Violations could result in IRS penalties and the loss of tax-exempt status. So I can stand here and I can tell you, for instance, that from my reading of the scriptures, it is wrong to support certain policies. Where actually what I would do is I would tell you, think it over. Ask yourself, is it or is it not in alignment with the scriptures? But one thing I cannot do and should not do and would not do is say, God says, vote for this person, or don't vote for that one. To push it even further, I would say it is no one's place to identify someone as Christian or non-Christian by the color of their hat, nor to put anybody down whose social and political views derive from their sincere beliefs. And I mean that not only with respect to Christians, but to Muslims, to Buddhists, even to an atheist. Conscience matters. And that has been the social and religious consensus embodied in law, at least for the past 71 years. And for the most part, it has worked. Why do I bring this up? Well, I bring it up because this past week, the IRS reversed itself, declaring to a federal court that, and this is language drawn directly from the lawsuit and the filings. When a house of worship in good faith speaks to its congregation through its customary channels of communication on matters of faith in connection with religious services concerning electoral politics viewed through the lens of religious faith, it neither participates nor intervenes in a political campaign within the ordinary meaning of those words. In other words, go ahead, endorse candidates if you want to. The wording in the actual suit goes on like this. Thus, communications from a house of worship to its congregation in connection with religious services through its usual channels of communication on matters of faith do not run afoul of the Johnson Amendment as properly interpreted. Unquote. So when political parties send me, as they do at election time, candidate guides, where they will have something in front of me and it has columns and has names, and then it will say somebody's voting record here or here, righteous or unrighteous, Christian or non-Christian, biblical or non-biblical, that they expect and want me to hand out at the church door or put into the church newsletter or simply pile up for someone to see. That would be perfectly fine. It's not. It is not fine. This statement that came out this past week means that the deal that has worked, deal, the pattern that has worked for the past 71 years is off. It's an intervention. It's a breaking down of a boundary that has been biblical and that has been healthy for everyone involved. But let's point out, along with the message to Smyrna in the book of Revelation, that when rulers look for endorsement, they will start to expect endorsement. And in time, at least under the Romans, they began to demand endorsement. And when the churches of the New Testament had to tell the political powers that there were boundaries and that the church would not rubber stamp everything that the authorities wanted to do, that they were not the only authority and they were not the highest authority, then they ended up with the situation that John predicted would come to Smyrna, where somebody like the exiled prophet had to pass on a word from the Lord to the rest of the believers, a word that said, "Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Beware, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you'll have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Keep that boundary firm. That was a true word that continues to be a true and, I'm sorry to say it, necessary word to be spoken. One that must not be unheard. It's not a message you want to hear spoken in your own day. Heaven knows it's not one I want to bring up. I would be so much happier if we could talk about salvation, about the glory of God, instead of about this stuff that's about us. But it is about God and about God's kingdom. Because once the state oversteps its place, it becomes harder and harder to keep it from trampling in other places it has no business going. And it's bad for everyone. You know, Dr. Early was right. It was about 10 years after I spoke with him that day that I ended up with glasses. And I did have to switch to skim milk. And most of the time, I have come to favor chicken or turkey instead of red meat. Not that I don't sit down for the occasional burger or sloppy joes. But I took him seriously, and I'm glad I did. I have decent blood pressure. I have no significant problems to complain about if you don't count the fuzzy hearing in my right ear that has nothing to do with the stuff you warned about, or the trigger finger over here that comes and goes and makes my handwriting messy some days. He was right. And I ignored his prophecies about ice cream and potato chips, which is why now I'm trying to drop a few pounds without getting too crazy about things. You have to listen sometimes and be aware. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.